Hello, I am
Aesthetics Explained.
this is Corey, and we will be making every day a new crazy video you can enjoy. And that's it.
Messy, hyperactive, and debaucherous, the indie sleaze aesthetic was an iconic moment in 2000s history. Lasting from 2008 to roughly 2012, the aesthetic was first coined indie sleaze by TikTok trend forecaster Mandy Lee, and the term perfectly encapsulates the slinky, grimy, performatively retro nightlife style of late 2000s hipsters. And any aesthetic that involves drinking terrible vodka while dancing to girl talk mashups in 80s infused outfits is worth understanding. So let's get into it and deconstruct the party of 2008. Background. To begin, I want to say that this aesthetic is extremely similar to the hipster aesthetic. It pretty much came into fashion at the same time and for the same reasons, as the Great Recession of 2007 saw a dismissal of logo flaunting and materialistic styles like McBling in replacement for hipsters' vintage and socially conscious style. I'm going to avoid talking about things I've already gone over in the hipster video, so I recommend taking a look at that first for a more detailed coverage of this time. However, I do think there is a small but important difference between hipsters and indie sleaze. Namely, hipsters emphasize minimalistic, vintage, and non-conforming styles, while indie sleaze was what many hipsters looked like at 2 AM. That is messy, provocative, and opulent. It came to consciousness through the rise of a number of cultural artifacts in the 2000s. Firstly, there was the rise of indie music. From the 70s to the 90s, indie music referred to those on independent records that remained largely underground and off commercial radio. In the 2000s, the music industry was changing with the increase of the internet as a promotional tool, MP3 downloads over hard record sales, and the rise of the iPod, which made playlist music the norm. This opened the path for independent artists to achieve mainstream success. Another term for this period of culture is bloghouse, referring to the amount of indie artists being discovered on MySpace, media sharing platforms like Mediafire, LimeWire, and music blogs like The Hype Machine. Underground artists were now being played everywhere across nightclubs, giving hipsters their version of non-mainstream music on their nights out, and legitimizing indie dance parties as a cultural phenomenon. There was also the rise in popularity of a teen drama in the UK called Skins, which helped cement indie sleaze into the 2000s. Think of it as the Euphoria before Euphoria, and it was both praised and critiqued for its gritty and dark portrayal of teens and their debaucherous partying. During the late 2000s, the show gave rise to the term Skins Party, which referred to a specific overindulgent and debauched night of heavy drinking and drugs, often organised by teens over their MySpaces. There was also a mass amount of indie it girls in the late 2000s. Think Peaches Geldof, Alexa Chung, Agnes Dean, Sky Ferreira, Atlanta DeCadenet, Corey Kennedy, and so on. These girls seemingly never left a party until the sun came up and made hipster messy partying look chic. This is what's interesting about indie sleaze. Its feel of hedonistic excess was very much reminiscent of its predecessor McBling. Rebelling against the economic climate, many hipsters were minimalist and vintage by day, and indulgent and electric at night. And yes, this might seem contradictory, but it represented the conflicted, youthful climate of the 2000s that wanted rebellion. Much like McBling rebelled against conservatism by over-the-top flaunting of wealth, indie sleaze rebelled against the harsh economic landscape of the late 2000s by embracing decadence. The youth of 2000s were left with the repercussions of what the generation before them did to the economy. So they said F that, grabbed their cigarettes, cheap vodka, digital cameras, and leather jackets, and made their way to the underground warehouse party waiting for them. Clothes. To understand this aesthetic thoroughly, I want to try and contextualize its influences. While indie sleaze was definitely distinct, all fashion trends are cyclical, tending to reappear every 20 to 30 years. Therefore, while McBling took most of its influences from 70s disco, indie sleaze was all about the 80s. In the late 80s, following the emergence of rave culture, electronic dance music achieved mainstream popularity in Europe and some areas of the USA, such as Miami and New York. The bold music went well with 80s maximalist aesthetics that included things like bright neon colours, shiny fabrics, big makeup, big hair, and anything over the top. Meanwhile, on the other side of the spectrum, 80s and 90s grunge was in opposition to this opulence, creating anti-fashion looks that upheld their ethics of non-conformity, casualness, and socially conscious vintage. Indie sleaze embraced the rise in hipster culture that took a lot of influence from 80s and 90s grunge, and combined that with the 80s electro maximalism for their after dark trashiness. High fashion also influenced indie sleaze, specifically the work of Eddie Slimane, who began showcasing his skinny and androgynous silhouettes in the early 2000s, well before the aesthetic began, for YSL and Dior Homme. His styles became the norm for 2000s indie fashion, especially as he often dressed indie musicians during the decade and commissioned their music for his runway shows. Now, as we get into specific items, I covered a lot of them in the hipster video, so rather than repeating myself, here's a brief rundown of the crossover. There were skinny jeans, resurrecting a classic 80s trend and being cemented in fashion by Slimane, pattern tights, taking note from 80s maximalist sportswear, loose or oversized tops, especially with vintage t-shirts for that love of retro, leather jackets, attempting to encapsulate a rebellious and retro edge, flannels and big oversized cardigans, taking notes from hipster grunge icons, shorts over tights, tank tops with Aztec patterns, muscle tees, inspired by a very popular 80s style, V-necks, faux leather pants, and lastly tops that hung off the shoulder, often revealing bras underneath, that were reminiscent of 80s workout sweaters. This underwear as outerwear trend also extended to see-through lacy slip dresses, taking influence from slinky 90s party lingerie dresses. I also spoke about faux fur in the McBling video, and this was a big trend of indie sleaze, as they tried to create styles that symbolized decadence, especially with faux fur vests and shaggy fur coats. Two items I haven't really discussed before but were a key part of indie sleaze were the disco pant and love of lame. Both were a remake of popular 70s and 80s disco items, designed to attract attention and reflect the dance floor lights. The disco pant was particularly popular after Olivia Newton-John wore a similar style in Greece. Meanwhile, lame dates back to royalty in the Middle East between 2500 BC and 600 AD, and was long associated with affluence, especially in the 20s flapper movements being once a very expensive fabric. However, cheaper versions became available by the 70s, which meant they were available for mass disco styles. Both these styles' history and representation of opulent partying made them perfect for an indie sleaze resurrection, especially as American apparel brought them back to public consciousness. Accessories. A number of accessories I covered in the hipster video were big in this aesthetic. Things like fedora hats, a nod to vintage styles, kufiya scarves, an item from the Middle East that has also been used as a symbol of resistance by Palestine, horn-rimmed glasses, loved by hipsters, and Ray-Bans, so many Ray-Bans, especially coloured Ray-Bans, and were another revival of a super popular 80s trend. I also talked about the use of tights for hipsters, especially mesh, patterned, and rip tights, and while these were also a component of indie sleaze, another big trend was neon coloured tights. This was directly influenced from the 80s when neon colours had become a big thing. This was for many reasons, like the bold and bright fitness craze, a rise of neon and pop culture media, particularly MTV animation and promos that were unabashedly colourful, and many celebrities joining in on the trend. But perhaps more than anything, neon represented the optimism of the decade. The 70s mostly became known as a time where there was recession and a rise in crime. But under the conservative politics of the 80s, affluent countries were supposedly thriving, even if that wasn't always true, and bold bright neon played into symbolic happiness perfectly. It's interesting that neon got revived in indie sleaze because it coincided with the Great Recession. I interpret this as an example of youthful rebellion to the grim economic climate, with signifiers of maximalism and optimism. Other accessories included ballet flats, whose history I covered in the Preppy video, and were a massive trend of the 2000s in general. These aviator sunglasses are a revival of a super popular 80s style. Oxford brogues, a very vintage design I covered in the hipster video, and the peep-toe heel, an iconic component of the aesthetic. These first became popular in the 40s after the war, and then later majorly came back in the 80s, making them perfect for indie sleaze. There were also ankle boots, especially after 2009 where they were seen on high fashion catwalks, including Chloe and Marc Jacobs. The boot that was once popular in the Victorian era had another moment in mod styles of the 60s, who would often pair the Chelsea boot with skinny pants, becoming major inspiration for the indie sleaze ankle boot revival. In terms of jewellery, tacky and cheap party souvenir jewellery was big, as well as excessive and bold styles. This included bulky chains and layered necklaces, multiple large earrings, etc. This was largely a recreation of 80s trends where jewellery got very excessive. However, chain necklaces came directly from 80s hip-hop that was becoming commercially popular and therefore massively influenced 80s general trends. Hair and beauty. The aim of indie sleaze hair and beauty styles was to look like you're partying too hard to care. Scruffy and tousled hair was big, especially with side bangs, which was one of the defining hairstyles of the aesthetic. Bleached or coloured hair that looked dry or in need of care was also popular. The rooster shag hair was also a popular style, making the wearer look particularly indie musician-esque, who were likely inspired by rock stars of the past like Keith Richards. Hair accessories included low-sitting hippie-style headbands, sweatbands inspired by Richie Tenenbaum, who was a character in Wes Anderson's 2001 movie The Royal Tenenbaums, and was a reference to hipsters' love for Wes Anderson, and was also a revival of a massive 80s fitness trend. Makeup focused on bold lips to stand out, inspired by 80s flashy makeup, as well as messy late-night party looks. For example, chipped nail polish and disorderly smudged eyeliner was an iconic part of the aesthetic, bringing in the hipster grunge element. Messy and smudged glitter was also seen, and glitter has long been a symbol of self-expression, rebellious glamour, and opulence after it was first created in the 30s, particularly in the LGBTIQA+ community, and a lot in 70s glam rock. Think David Bowie during his Ziggy Stardust days. It was also a strong component of rave and disco culture throughout the late 20th century, so the trend makes sense for the partying indie sleaze aesthetic. Other visual cues. Flash photography. Perhaps one of the strongest visual cues of indie sleaze was flash photography, particularly party flash photography, and extra points if they had watermarks. One of the main contributors to this was Mark Hunter, otherwise known as the Cobra Snake, who became one of the most prominent party photographers of the era. This was because of the debaucherous and often provocative energy of his photos, his relationship with it girl Corey Kennedy, his proximity to fame, and his website, which was like the Instagram before Instagram, where people would spend hours scrolling through trying to spot themselves or someone they knew, or just to get that hit of FOMO. Another key influencer in this trend was Terry Richardson, whose distinguishable style almost always included flash. Like the Cobra Snake, Richardson was also known for his provocative images, even in high fashion campaigns, and they strongly resonated with the rebellious indie sleazers. Brands. At its peak, American Apparel was one of the most popular teen retail stores in the 2000s. It sold classic vintage styles that were born and bred in Los Angeles and advertised in provocative lo-fi campaigns which resonated with hipster minimalist teens. These advertisements, in all their flash photography glory, are defining visuals of the aesthetic, especially with their focus on 80s bold items. Then there was the House of Holland, which was founded by Henry Holland, who around 2006 began creating 80s-inspired bright neon t-shirts with cheeky and provocative slogans. They were so popular he launched his fashion house in 2008, and with endorsements from celebrities throughout his career and his bold maximalist style, Holland's garish label became iconic in the aesthetic. And lastly, there was Nylon Magazine, whose focus on hipster content in both print and YouTube made it super popular in the aesthetic, helping to launch it girls like Corey Kennedy into mainstream consciousness. Technology. With no ability to upload photos from your phone directly to social media until later, the compact digital camera was a necessity for the indie sleazers' night out. Many photos were taken on flashing digital compact cameras, curated the following day, and then uploaded to Facebook albums, which also became a defining visual cue of the aesthetic. There were also iPods, who have been around since 2001, but were always popular with indie sleazers because of their love for music, and because Apple advertisements endorsed indie bands. Additionally, through hipsters' love of alternative and vintage things, Polaroid photos also became popular. And now we get to cell phones. T-Mobile sidekicks and flip phones were there at the beginning as elements of McBling hung around, but began to decline in popularity in the late 2000s due to the rise of touchscreen smartphones. While the first iPhone of 2007 was super popular, probably more visible in the indie sleaze aesthetic was a BlackBerry, which was a major status statement from the mid-2000s to the late 2000s, being expensive, a celebrity favourite, and big in the corporate world. The BlackBerry Bold first arrived in 2008 and was probably the most iconic, having a leather back for a chic feel. Early social media. MySpace may have been there at the start of the aesthetic, but by the time the aesthetic was really well known, MySpace was being replaced by Facebook. While MySpace was busy and often chaotic in its presentation, Facebook was sleek, minimal, and non-fuss, which suited hipsters' emphasis on casualness, and so it quickly became their space for sharing their nights out. The decline. Indie sleaze began to fall out of popularity in 2012. Aside from elements continuing in the Tumblr girl aesthetic of 2014, particularly their love for Skin's character Effie Stone, who wore many indie sleaze outfits during its era. But overall, by 2013, the aesthetic was largely considered dated. This was probably caused by a number of reasons, but a big part of it was the rise in popularity of phone photos rather than digital cameras, and social media platforms like Instagram becoming more prominent than Facebook for photo sharing. More and more we were becoming aware of our online presence and how to curate our lives to look a certain way. But what made indie sleaze was the candidness it brought out in its participants. With that gone, the aesthetic didn't have much life in it anymore. With social surveillance from phones and social media increasing, people were less comfortable posing for provocative photos, looking hedonistic, looking wasted, and well, looking sleazy. Which brings me to the flaws I can see within this aesthetic. Many who were a part of the scene have since made statements about its dark side, particularly in its overuse of drugs and treatment of women. Girls from this period have expressed the feeling of objectification towards their bodies and the pressure to be ultra thin, which was normalised by the aesthetic. A source in Rhiannon Coslet's article for The Guardian said, "My overriding memories involve starving myself to fit into the required uniform and putting so many drugs up my nose that I still have no feeling in my right nostril." This becomes particularly pressing when we think about the fact that a lot of the provocative style photography focused on women more than it did on men, especially when it came to nudity. When discussing her book on late 2000s club culture, Lena Abaskal notes that a lot of shady stuff was happening with underage girls, and the culture had a tendency to be exploitative of women. Let's not forget that two people who had a major influence on the look of the aesthetic, Terry Richardson and Dov Charney, founder of American Apparel, have both had multiple accusations of sexual harassment stemming from this period.
Good Jeffree Star, yeah.
I had a dream that I was JonBenet Ramsey. How are you?
It's kind of obvious now looking back that a lot of what was being presented to us as fun, harmless hedonism may have been covering up a lot of misogyny and predatory behaviour. However, if these problems are rectified in future embodiments of the aesthetic, the next generation indie sleaze has the potential to be very exciting. Its presentation of genuine fun and freedom left its mark on all of us. It was the last spat of millennials effortlessly partying in the moment and being uncurated hot messes, before the culture moved into the era of perfectly presented Instagram feeds and Facetune. For so many of us, there was nothing like these aesthetics at the end of a decade. There was nothing like partying like it's 2008. What do you think about the indie sleaze aesthetic? Let me know in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.